Well, I didn't want to believe it, but Kofi Jones is dead. Honestly a little bit frustrated with the way that this happened. I feel like his death was kind of inevitable because the Baxters were going to get him sooner or later. Either that or he was going to give up the Desiatos and then the story would be over because once the Baxter family finds out what Adam did, then the story is going to be over for the Desiatos. But I feel a little bit frustrated that they played this out as a cliffhanger. They tried to bring viewers back by letting Kofi Jones' fate hang in the balance. And to me, that's a little bit frustrating. I think the over reliance on cliffhangers on television and particularly serialized shows is dumb because people are either invested in a show or they're not, and a cliffhanger isn't necessarily going to pull anyone back if they weren't already invested. But this particular cliffhanger was frustrating because the opening shot of the episode establishes, well, he's dead. Great. But this episode, it's interesting because you would think that given that Kofi Jones, the only person who could really point out that he wasn't the one driving the car when the hit and run happened, is dead, and you see the car at the same time as they're taking Kofi Jones' body away, you see the car being compacted. So all the evidence, or a good deal of the evidence that would tie the Desiato family to what happened to the Baxter boy has been disappeared, so to speak. So you would think that a lot of the tension would dissipate from this show, but not so. This episode definitely had a lot of interesting and tense moments, particularly the table scene later in the episode, which was a very, very engaging scene because you just weren't sure where the next bombshell was going to come from because everybody at the table knew something or could say something that would trigger somebody else at the table. And Bryan Cranston's reactions as his character Michael is the only one who realizes how dangerous having all these different characters at the table, including the newly introduced character of his sister-in-law played by Margo Martindale. Having them all at the same table put him in such a vulnerable spot, and there were so many moments where you could see things going dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. And obviously, Nancy, played by Amy Landecker, has a lot of information that she could put together and come to the right conclusion. And maybe she will. And maybe it's just a matter of time and not when. But this whole scene was well staged and well acted, and the back and forth between the actors was fantastic. I appreciated the expanded role for the character of Charlie, played by Veep alum Isaiah Whitlock Jr. This episode, I think that he's doing quite a good job. I appreciated his interactions with Bryan Cranston's character, where Bryan Cranston is showing he feels this guilt for what happened to Kofi Jones, and Charlie's response is essentially, are you going to do anything about it? If not, then shut up. And I feel like as a viewer, that's kind of my reaction to Michael and Adam to a greater extent in this episode, because they seem really, really torn up by what has happened to Kofi Jones. And I'm sure that what happened to Kofi Jones' family at the end of this episode with the Baxters initiating violent retribution on them, I'm sure that's going to tear them up even further. But they're not really doing anything to really, really protect the Jones. Like bringing Lee in as a defender for Kofi Jones, yeah, that's nice, but he's going to jail for what your son did, and now he's been killed and his family has suffered because of what your son did. You can't take that back. And obviously, to a certain extent, as Charlie put it, they didn't know what was going to happen. But as this episode explores at length, when you start lying, you just don't know where it's going to lead. And it's an interesting episode because early on in the episode, the character of Franny says to Adam that, there are truths that are worth protecting with lies. And that's really the theme, I think, that gets really a lot of exploration this episode. You see it in the conversation between Michael and his sister-in-law when he tries to convince her that Adam was only lying about leaving flowers and a card on his mother's grave, which she has completely blown their alibi, by the way. But when Michael is trying to convince her that he was only lying about this because he cares about her and it's important to him that she believe that he hasn't forgotten his mother, she says, "Do you hear yourself?" Essentially pointing out the hypocrisy of lying to protect the truth. And we see it in a lot of small scenes. We see it in the way that the prison warden claims that there are no homicides at his prison and essentially tells his prison doctor to cover up the death of Kofi Jones, that it was a murder. But Lee, diligent prosecutor that she is going to keep digging. And at this point, I feel kind of worse for her than any character because she's only trying to do the right thing. She has no personal stake in any of this. Yes, she's in a relationship with Michael, but she doesn't know she's being manipulated. She's doing what she's doing because she genuinely cares about Kofi Jones and the fate of people like him. And the show is doing a really good job. I think it's a little bit of an outlandish show at times. More on that in a second. But I think it's doing a good job showing the ways in which the justice system doesn't really care as much about the fates of individuals like Kofi Jones as it could. And it's showing this through a number of different characters. We see different people within the system and how some of them might even have good intentions. Amy Landecker's character, for instance, she's focused on the victims to the exclusion of the perpetrators. But I think that, the justice system has to think of both in the way that it dispenses justice. But the show is doing a really good job of exploring how people like Kofi Jones, their fates are not as important as other things, such as these truths that people like the prison warden would rather protect than jeopardize by allowing for people like Kofi Jones to be protected and for the justice to be dispensed as far as his death goes. The Baxter family, they're a mess this episode. It's interesting because I feel like if there's a character that has been underplayed so far, it's Michael Stuhlbarg's Baxter patriarch. But it's interesting this episode, we get to see that to a certain extent, that's because he is kind of just an impotent rage monster. And we see, him lashing out at anyone and everyone. We saw this in the episode where he smashed the bird cage with his son's bird inside. But we see it this episode also in the fact that he blows up Kofi Jones' family, which again, why is he lashing out at them? What is this going to do? They really, really had nothing to do with it. But the family of Kofi Jones and Kofi Jones himself have kind of been representative of how the minority communities in New Orleans have kind of been victimized by the justice system. We saw in the first episode that Kofi Jones' mother was going to be put away due to the false witness of a police officer. And we saw Kofi Jones put away because it was more expedient that Charlie be protected than that the truth should come out. And in this episode, of course, we see the Baxter family lashing out and the ultimate problem, the ultimate penalty being paid by Kofi Jones' family. And again, when it comes to Michael Stuhlbarg, I feel like his performance is a little over the top, but it's interesting to see he's not really leading his own family. You see this in subtle ways. Hope Davis is playing her part very well, but one of my favorite line deliveries during this episode was the way she delivered the line, "We're helping you to," I think it was something along the lines of, "We're helping you to do what you really mean to do." And the manipulation in that line is really, really blatant, and it's interesting trying to figure out how aware Michael Stuhlbarg is that his wife is running things behind his back. The biggest injustice this episode, obviously, is that Kofi Jones was beaten to death, but the Baxter boy is going to get off scot-free, not going to have time added to his sentence. And again, we see here the danger that Michael and Adam are in, that they're trying to protect themselves and the rest of their family, and what happened to Kofi Jones and his family could just as easily happen to them. If it was just the prison time, obviously Michael would let Adam turn himself in, but he can't bear to see Adam die, and his desire to protect his son has taken him well outside the law. And this episode, it's a little bit of a slow burn, but I have to say I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I enjoyed the focus on new characters. I enjoyed the way that it explored how the justice system can sometimes try to protect certain things that it thinks are more expedient at the cost of people like Kofi Jones. And I think that overall the show is staying strong, even if it is, like I said, a little bit outlandish. I think some of you have theorized that Franny is related to the Baxter family, and this episode we get to see a little bit more of the Baxter family's daughter who is having a crisis of faith, and Adam even runs into her at her brother's vigil, which to me just all lends credibility to this. And if there's one problem that I have with the writing in this show is that there's just a lot of coincidences to swallow. So many things where, what are the odds that Michael would be the judge at Kofi Jones' mother's trial, or that the Baxters would be related to this person that Adam is in a relationship with and to whom he has confessed this truth about the hit and run. Now, this has not been proven yet, but the resemblance between these two characters is pretty striking, and I think that this theory is probably on the money. So I feel like this critique of the justice system might be a little bit more effective in a show that was a little less out there, but I'm still enjoying the ride, particularly enjoying the performance by Bryan Cranston, and I'm excited to see what comes next. But let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, including American Gods, please consider subscribing. And if you give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.